She didn't cry when they pointed at the abandoned kitchen. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She just picked up her bag, the one bag that held everything she had left in this world, and she walked toward that cold, broken-down stone building like she had been walking toward it her whole life. Behind her, she heard Eleanor Graves laugh. Not loud, just enough. Clara stopped walking for one single second. Then she kept going. And that was the last time anyone on Blackwood Ridge Estate underestimated Clara Whitmore. If this story already has your heart, stay with us. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Clara Whitmore read it twice, then set it flat on the kitchen table, pressing her palm against the paper, the way you press a wound. Like if you hold it still long enough, the bleeding might stop on its own. Her father was dead. Not unexpected. He had been sick for the better part of 2 years, and Clara had nursed him through every one of those seasons, with a steadiness that people in Harlan County, Montana, admired without ever once saying so out loud. She had cooked for him, cleaned for him, managed what little was left of the farm, stretched every dollar until it nearly tore in half. She had done all of it without complaint, without anyone asking how she was holding up, without anyone stopping by to bring her a meal of her own. And now he was gone. And the letter, the second letter, the one that arrived 3 days after the notice of death, told her everything else. The farm had debt, more than she knew. Debts her father had carried quietly, the way men of that era carried shame folded up and tucked somewhere she couldn't see. The bank was not interested in sentiment. The land would be sold. The house would be emptied. Clara had 30 days to vacate the only home she had ever known. 30 days. She was 41 years old. She had no husband, no children, no living relatives within 3 states. She had a small trunk of belongings, a worn leather recipe book her mother had pressed into her hands the year before she died, and roughly $11 to her name. She sat with that letter for a long time. Then she stood up, put the kettle on, and started making a list. That was Clara. She didn't spiral. She didn't dissolve. She made lists. The list, as it turned out, was short and brutal. There were 3 families in Harlan County who might take her in as a housekeeper. 2 of them had daughters her age already managing the household. One of them, the Dunleavys, had been quietly unkind to her since childhood. The kind of unkind that never raised its voice, but always made you feel smaller than you arrived. She crossed them all off. There was one option left. Blackwood Ridge Estate. 40 miles northeast up into the harder country, where the winters came earlier and stayed longer, and the land didn't apologize for either. The estate was owned by William Harrington, a man Clara had never met, but had heard about the way you hear about weather at a distance, secondhand, always with some weight to it. They said he had been a different man before his wife died. People in 3 counties said it. That before Margaret Harrington passed the estate had been a living, breathing place, workers who stayed for decades, a kitchen that fed 30 people a day, laughter in the main house. And after people left, the kitchen staff dwindled. The estate manager, a woman named Eleanor Graves, who had arrived with Margaret's death like she'd been waiting in the wings, began running things with the kind of cold efficiency that kept the books clean and the people small. Clara did not know any of this in detail. She knew only that Blackwood Ridge was hiring. She wrote a letter. Plain direct, no embellishment. She listed what she could do: cook, preserve, manage a kitchen track supplies plan for seasons. She did not list her situation. She did not explain that she had nowhere else to go. She had enough pride left for that. The response came 8 days later. A single paragraph in a stiff formal hand that Clara immediately recognized as the voice of someone who did not want you there, but had been overruled by necessity. Your application has been reviewed. A position is available. Report to Blackwood Ridge Estate no later than the 1st of November. Room and board provided. Wages minimal. Duties to be assigned upon arrival. It was signed by Eleanor Graves. There was no welcome in it. Not a syllable. Clara folded the letter, put it in her coat pocket, and began packing. She arrived on October 31st, one day early. because she had learned long ago that arriving early was one of the few advantages a woman with nothing could give herself. The wagon that carried her from the crossroads let her off at the base of the hill, and she walked the last quarter-mile herself, trunk in hand, into a wind that had already decided it didn't care for her. The estate was large. That was the first thing she noticed. Large and strangely quiet for a working ranch. The main house stood 3 stories of dark timber, and stone and smoke came from 2 chimneys, but the yard had the feel of a place that had stopped expecting visitors. A few ranch hands moved between the barn and the eastern fence. None of them looked up when she came through the gate. She knocked at the front door. The woman who opened it was perhaps 50, with gray-streaked hair pulled back tight enough to look like a decision, and eyes the color of river ice in February. "You're early," Eleanor Graves said. "Yes, ma'am," Clara said. "I apologize if that's inconvenient." Eleanor looked at her the way you look at something you've been asked to sign for that you didn't order. Then she stepped back and let Clara inside, and that small motion, that barely a welcome, was the warmest thing Eleanor Graves would ever offer her. The entry hall was cold, beautiful once Clara could tell. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, a staircase that curved upward with the kind of craftsmanship you didn't see anymore. But the rugs were threadbare now. The wall sconces held half-burned candles nobody had replaced. The whole house had the feeling of a place that had given up mourning and settled into something worse, a kind of permanent, exhausted stillness. Eleanor led her through the main hall without speaking, down a back corridor, through a side door, and out into the yard again, around the east wing, past the tool storage, past the woodpile, and Clara kept pace and kept quiet, because she was reading the estate the way you read a room, learning it, filing it, asking herself what was wrong and how it could be fixed. They stopped in front of a stone building set back from the rest. It was smaller than the main house kitchen. Single-story thick walls, a chimney that had gone black with disuse. The door was warped in its frame. One shutter hung crooked from a broken hinge. The single window was opaque with grime. "This is the east kitchen," Eleanor said. "It hasn't been used in some years. You'll be housed here, and you'll operate from here." Clara looked at the building. She looked at it for a long moment. "The main kitchen is occupied by my existing staff," Eleanor continued. "We don't have additional room there. This was the original kitchen before the main house was expanded. You can use it for whatever you find useful." A pause that held everything Eleanor wasn't saying. "I assumed you'd want to make yourself useful." "I will," Clara said. "Good." Eleanor turned to go, then paused. "There are some basic provisions. Enough to get started. Beyond that, you'll need to work with what the estate has available. I manage all supply orders from the main office. Anything you need goes through me." "Understood," Clara said. Eleanor walked back toward the main house without a backward glance. Clara stood in front of the stone kitchen for another moment. The wind pushed at her coat. The sky above the ridge was the pale gray of old dishwater. Then she pushed the warped door open and walked inside. The smell hit her first. Dust and rot, and something metallic underneath the old iron stove. She guessed the rust already doing its patient work. The light came in thin through the filthy window and showed her exactly what she had been given. Nothing. Old shelves along the left wall, empty except for broken crockery and a few forgotten tools. A work table in the center wood, scarred and stained but still solid. The iron stove in the right corner, massive and cold and orange-red with rust along every joint. A pile of old sacking in the back corner. A stack of broken barrel staves. A single iron hook above the door where someone had once hung something and forgotten it. Clara set her trunk down on the work table. She opened it. She took out her mother's recipe book and set it on the shelf above the stove. Then she took off her good coat, folded it carefully, set it on top of the trunk, and went to find a broom. That night, by the light of a single tallow candle she had brought in her trunk, Clara wrote in her small notebook, the same notebook she used for supply tracking and planning, a single line at the top of a fresh page. November 1st, 1878. Blackwood Ridge. Start here. She was not a woman who wasted words even in her own private writing. She had learned early that sentiment without action was just noise. So she did not write about how cold the room was, or how her hands ached, or how the loneliness of this particular night felt heavier than any she had known since her father's passing. She wrote what needed to be done. The list filled half the page. Fix the stove. Seal the window. Repair the door frame. Clean the shelves. Assess the available stores. Locate the vegetable garden. Survey the storage barns. Understand the supply schedule. Introduce herself to the ranch workers. She underlined that last one, not because it was the most important fixing. The stove was the most important because without heat, she would not survive the week in that stone room. But because she understood something that Eleanor Graves had not considered when she sent Clara out here, the ranch workers were the estate's real intelligence network. They knew where things were, what was wasted, what was running low, what had been forgotten. You didn't get that knowledge by going through the estate manager. You got it by making people soup. The next morning, Clara was up before dawn. She was not the type of woman who needed to be coaxed into the day. She had grown up on a farm where the morning began in darkness, and you either kept up with it or you fell behind and never caught up. So at 4:30, she was already moving, already working, and by the time the pale light began coming through the newly cleaned window, she had scrubbed it by moonlight the night before, using a rag and a bucket of water she'd hauled from the well. She had already stripped and cleaned the iron stove's exterior, identified which parts of the rusted joints could be sealed with rendered lard, and which needed actual repair, and found the stack of seasoned wood behind the east storage barn that nobody had told her about. She lit the first fire in the east kitchen at 7:15 in the morning. It smoked terribly. She expected that years of disuse had clogged the flue with debris, and she spent the better part of an hour at the chimney top with a long-handled brush she fashioned from a birch branch and a handful of stiff bristles she found in the tool pile, clearing it by feel and sound, while the cold wind tried to push her off her footing. When she climbed back down and reopened the stove damper, the draft pulled clean, and the smoke went where it was supposed to go, and the fire, her fire, the first fire in this kitchen, in God knew how many years caught and held, and started filling the stone room with warmth. Clara stood in front of it for exactly 1 minute. She let herself feel it, the warmth on her face, the smell of burning wood in a place that had been cold and abandoned, the small private satisfaction of a thing done that was supposed to be impossible. Then she went back to work. She had identified 3 problems in her first 12 hours at the estate, and they were bigger than the broken stove and the rotting door and the empty shelves. The first problem was waste. Walking the property on her early morning survey, she had been up before anyone else and moved quietly enough that most people didn't notice her. She had counted 4 separate piles of discarded food waste that should never have been discarded. Vegetable trimmings, bone scraps from slaughtered animals, grain husks. All of it piled at the edge of the east field, like something shameful to be hidden, when all of it could have been rendered into broth feed compost or fuel. She said nothing about this to anyone yet. She just noted it. The second problem was the garden. Behind the east storage barn, past the second woodpile, and the broken-down wagon that everyone seemed to be pretending didn't exist. There was a kitchen garden that had been planted sometime in the last decade and then slowly forgotten. The beds were overgrown, yes. The fencing had collapsed in 2 places, but the soil was still rich and dark underneath the weeds. And when Clara pulled up a clump of the dead ground cover near the south bed, she found beneath the frost-stiffened surface layer something that made her stop and look very carefully. Parsnips, a whole row of them, left in the ground through autumn, which was actually the best thing you could do with a parsnip. The cold sweetened them. Nobody had come to pull them because nobody remembered this garden existed. She found carrots in the same condition in the next bed. She found dried herb stems along the fence that still held seeds. She found at the very back of the garden a row of winter squash that had been left on the vine and had somehow survived the early frosts, their skins gone thick and hard, the way good squash did when it was properly cold stored by accident. Clara stood in that abandoned garden in the first light of a November morning, surrounded by food that nobody knew was there, and she felt something she hadn't felt in months. She felt possibility. The third problem was the ice. The estate had an ice house. She had found it on her survey, a low stone building near the north fence, but it hadn't been properly stocked. There was ice from the previous winter, old and shrinking, and the stocks of preserved meat and dairy that should have been stored there were poorly wrapped and positioned, badly losing cold efficiency. It wasn't catastrophic yet, but come deep winter it would be. She made her notes. She made her plans. She said nothing to Eleanor Graves, because she had understood something in her first conversation with Eleanor, something that the estate manager had communicated clearly without meaning to. Clara was out here in the East Kitchen because Eleanor Graves wanted her out of the way. If Clara went to Eleanor with problems and solutions, Eleanor would not be pleased. She would not say, "What a wonderful initiative, how helpful." She would say, "I didn't authorize that." She would pull the one advantage she had, which was control of the supply orders and the estate accounts, and she would use it to make Clara's already difficult position more difficult. So Clara did not go to Eleanor. She went to Samuel Carter. She found him at the south fence the following morning, an older man with white hair and the kind of hands you only got from 60-plus years of physical work. Big, scarred, stiff in the cold, but still strong. He was mending fence wire alone, and he did not look up when she approached. "Mr. Carter," she said. He glanced at her sideways. "Miss Whitmore." He had a voice like gravel settling, low and unhurried. "I was hoping you might walk the eastern pastures with me this morning," she said. "Show me where things are." He stopped working and looked at her straight on for the first time. He had seen her arrive. He had seen Eleanor Graves take her to the East Kitchen. He had probably, Clara figured, given her about 3 days before she packed up and went back wherever she came from. "Why?" he said. "Because you've been here long enough to know what this estate had before, and I'd like to understand it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he set his wire cutters on the fence post and straightened up with the slow care of a man whose back had made its peace with its limitations. "All right," he said. "Come on then." They walked for 2 hours. Samuel Carter didn't talk much, but what he said was precise and useful, and completely unfiltered by any desire to protect anyone's feelings or position. He showed her where the second well was, the one near the east barn that everyone had stopped using because the main house well was closer. He showed her the root cellar behind the storage barn, half full of supplies that had been badly organized and were beginning to turn. He showed her the smokehouse that had stopped being used 3 years ago when the last man who knew how to operate it properly had left the estate. "Why'd he leave?" Clara asked. Samuel looked at her. "Same reason most people leave. Miss Graves doesn't like to be told things." He told her the smokehouse needed to be kept active through autumn. She said it was an unnecessary expense. He left. She ordered smoked meat from town. Cost 4 times as much, and you can't always depend on the road. Clara nodded slowly. "And Mr. Harrington, does he know about any of this?" Samuel stopped walking. He looked out across the pasture for a moment at the mountains beyond, at the pale November sky. "Mr. Harrington hasn't been paying attention," he said. "Not since Mrs. Harrington passed. He goes through the accounts. He signs papers. He rides the fence line every 2 weeks like he's trying to remember why it matters. But he's not—" He stopped, started again. "He's not here the way a man needs to be here to know what's happening to his own property." He said it without judgment, just fact. Clara understood. She had seen grief do that to people, take them out of themselves so completely that the whole world became something seen through glass, visible but untouchable. "The smokehouse," she said, changing the subject deliberately. "Do you know how to operate it?" Samuel looked at her. "I do." "Would you be willing to show me?" He studied her for a long moment. "You plan on using it?" "I plan on using everything on this property that can be used," Clara said, "beginning immediately." And something in Samuel Carter's face shifted then, just a fraction, just the smallest change around the eyes. And it wasn't quite hope, because he was too old and too experienced for quick hope. But it was something in that direction. Like a man who had been watching a place slowly come apart, and had just been given the first reason in a long time to think it might not. "All right, Miss Whitmore," he said. "I'll show you." That afternoon, Eleanor Graves sent one of the house girls to the East Kitchen with a message. Clara was to restrict her activities to the preparation of a morning meal for the Eastern field workers, a simple breakfast, porridge and bread, and to stay clear of the main supply stores without explicit authorization. Clara read the note. She set it on the work table. Then she went back to cleaning the root cellar. She was not going to fight Eleanor Graves directly. That was the wrong battle, and she knew it. A direct fight with the estate manager would make Clara look like a troublemaker, and troublemakers got sent away, and being sent away was not an option she intended to make available. Instead, she was going to do exactly what Eleanor had said. She was going to make herself useful. Just rather more useful than Eleanor had planned for. The East Kitchen workers' breakfast the following morning was not porridge. It was a thick potato and parsnip soup. Parsnips from the forgotten garden potatoes from the root cellar stores she had reorganized the day before, with bread made from the reserve flour she had found still good, pushed to the back of a shelf in the storage barn. She had also, because the morning was particularly bitter, made a pot of strong coffee using the beans she had brought in her trunk and grinding them herself. 6 workers came to the East Kitchen door that morning. They stood there looking at the soup like it might be a mistake. "Come in," Clara said. "It's hot." They came in. They sat at the work table which she had cleared and scrubbed. They ate. Nobody spoke for a while. Then a young hand named Pete, couldn't have been more than 19, looked up from his bowl and said, "Ma'am, this is the best thing I've eaten since I got here." "How long have you been here?" Clara asked. 8 months, he said. She looked at him. 19 years old. 8 months on this estate, eating whatever the main kitchen threw together, which from what she had gathered was not much and not warm. "Well," she said, "you'll eat better from now on." He looked at her like she'd said something in a foreign language that he was still translating. By the end of the first week, there were 11 workers coming to the East Kitchen for breakfast. By the end of the second week, there were 16. Nobody had authorized this. Eleanor certainly hadn't. But nobody had forbidden it either, and Clara had made a careful, deliberate decision to operate in the space between those two things, to do what was necessary and good and clearly beneficial to the estate, and to let the results speak before anyone had the chance to stop her. She was rendering lard from scraps that would have been thrown away. She was making bone broth from the carcasses that always ended up at the edge of the east field. She was pulling the forgotten vegetables from the garden every other morning, preserving what she couldn't use, immediately filling the shelves of the East Kitchen 1 jar at a time. She had restarted the smokehouse with Samuel Carter's help, and they were smoking strips of beef from the late autumn slaughter beef that would otherwise have been salted poorly and stored with less care than it deserved. She was writing everything down. Every ounce of what came in and what went out. Every preservation. Every ingredient saved. Every jar sealed. She kept the notebook with the same care her mother had kept the recipe book because she understood that the numbers mattered as much as the food. The numbers, if anyone ever looked at them, would tell a story. She was counting on that. In the 3rd week of November, William Harrington rode his fence line on a Tuesday morning the way Samuel had said he did every 2 weeks, and on his way back to the main house, he passed closer to the East Kitchen than he usually did, drawn perhaps by the smoke from the chimney, or by the smell of bread that had drifted across the cold air. He did not stop. But Clara, who was at the window pressing a new batch of lard through cheesecloth, saw him slow his horse. She saw him look at the kitchen. She saw him look at the smoke at the light in the window, at the half-dozen workers who were in the middle of their morning workday, stopping at the East Kitchen door to pick up a wrapped parcel of midday food she had started preparing. She saw him watch that for a moment. Then he rode on. But something had shifted. She could feel it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive, something in the air, something in the pressure of things. William Harrington had begun to notice. And Eleanor Graves, 3 days later, appeared at the East Kitchen door for the first time since Clara's arrival. She did not knock. She opened the door and stood in the frame, looking at the shelves full, now lined with jars of preserved vegetables and sealed containers of rendered fat, and carefully wrapped packages of dried herbs. She looked at the work table where Clara was rolling dough. She looked at the notebook open on the shelf beside the stove. She looked at all of it, and her face was very still and very controlled. "You've been busy," Eleanor said. "Yes, ma'am," Clara said. She did not stop working. "You've been exceeding the scope of what you were hired to do." Clara set down the rolling pin. She looked at Eleanor Graves directly, steadily, without hurry or heat. "I was asked to make myself useful," she said. "I'm doing that." "You were asked to prepare breakfast for the Eastern field workers." "Yes. And I've also been preserving food that would have spoiled, maintaining stores that were deteriorating, and restoring operations that were costing this estate more money in outside purchases than they needed to." A silence. "You had no authorization for any of that," Eleanor said. "No," Clara agreed. "I didn't ask for it either." She paused. "If you'd like me to stop, you'll need to tell Mr. Harrington that you've ordered me to let the food rot and the stores continue to deteriorate. I imagine he'd want to know why." It was the most direct thing Clara had said to anyone since arriving at Blackwood Ridge, and she felt the risk of it, even as she said it, felt it the way you feel the edge of a step in the dark. That sudden awareness that one small error in judgment puts you on the floor. But she held Eleanor's gaze, and Eleanor held hers, and neither of them moved. "Watch yourself, Miss Whitmore," Eleanor said finally. Her voice was very quiet. "You're here because nobody else would take you. Don't mistake that for security." She left without another word. Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment after the door closed. Her hands, she noticed, were absolutely steady. She had been afraid of Eleanor Graves when she arrived. She wasn't afraid now. She was something else, clear-eyed and careful and completely resolved. She picked up the rolling pin. She went back to work. Outside the east kitchen, the sky above Blackwood Ridge had turned the particular thick gray that old-timers in Montana knew well. Not the gray of an overcast day, not the gray of ordinary November. The gray of serious winter arriving early. Clara looked at it through the window. She looked at her shelves. She thought about what she had stored, and what she still needed to store, and how many weeks she had before the roads would close. Not enough time, she thought, but enough time to do more than anyone expects. She turned back to her work. And somewhere on the east field, Samuel Carter looked at the same sky and felt the cold coming in his bones, the deep cold, the kind that meant business. And then he looked at the smoke rising from the east kitchen chimney, steady and strong in the gray air. And he thought something. He hadn't thought about this estate in a long time. He thought maybe we're going to be all right. The cold came down from the mountains, like it had a score to settle. Clara felt it before she saw it, that particular shift in the air that had nothing polite about it, the kind of cold that didn't ease up in the afternoon and didn't apologize in the morning. She had grown up in Montana. She knew what that feeling meant. She gave herself 2 weeks, maybe 3, before the first serious snow. After that, the roads would be uncertain. After the second snow, they'd be gone. 2 weeks. She started working faster. The east kitchen was unrecognizable from what it had been when she arrived. The shelves that had held nothing but broken crockery and forgotten tools were now lined with jars, preserved carrots, parsnips, dried beans, sealed containers of rendered fat, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the iron hook above the door. The work table that had been scarred and filthy was scrubbed clean every evening. The iron stove held a fire from 4 in the morning until 9 at night, and the warmth it put out had changed the feel of the stone room entirely from a place of abandonment to something that felt improbably like purpose. But Clara wasn't satisfied. Not yet. Not even close. She sat with her notebook after supper on a Wednesday evening, the fire low, the wind pushing at the door, and she ran the numbers she had been tracking for 3 weeks. What the estate had, what it would need, what it was burning through too fast, what it wasn't using at all. The numbers were not good. The main kitchen. Eleanor Graves's domain was ordering supplies from town at a rate that assumed the roads would stay open all winter. It was a calculation Clara recognized immediately as the kind made by someone who had never personally watched a family go hungry when the wagon couldn't get through. The main supply order was heavy on luxury items and light on staples. Heavy on things that needed to come from town, and light on things the estate could produce and preserve itself. If the roads closed early, and Clara's bones were telling her they would, the main house would run short by February, maybe January. She turned to a fresh page in her notebook and wrote a careful, precise summary of what she had found and what she recommended. She wrote it the way her father had taught her to write anything meant to persuade a practical person. No emotion, no complaint. Just facts and numbers, and the logical conclusions they led to. Then she addressed it to William Harrington. She did not address it to Eleanor Graves. She was not naive about what that choice meant. She was making a decision, and she knew it. Going around Eleanor was a risk that could get her dismissed from the estate in a single afternoon. But going through Eleanor meant the information would never reach the man who actually needed to act on it, and acting on it was the point of everything. Clara sealed the note and gave it to Pete, the 19-year-old, who had been the first to compliment her soup, and who had since become, without either of them naming it, something like her informal courier. "Give this to Mr. Harrington directly," she said. "Not to Miss Graves, to him." Pete looked at the note. He looked at her. He was young, but not stupid. He understood immediately what she was asking and what it might cost her. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and he tucked it inside his coat like it was something valuable. Clara went back to her preserving. She didn't hear anything that day, or the next. On the third morning, Samuel Carter appeared at her door before sunrise, which was unusual. He typically came by in the late afternoon when his fence work was done. He didn't come inside. He just stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and said in his flat gravel voice, "Miss Graves knows about the note." Clara kept stirring the pot on the stove. "I expected she might." "She's angry." "I expected that too." "She told two of the house girls that you're trying to make yourself indispensable by going above her head and stirring up trouble." "Is that what she told them?" It wasn't a question. "It is." Clara reached for the salt, measured it, added it. "What did Mr. Harrington say?" Samuel was quiet for a beat. "Nobody knows. He read it. He didn't say anything to Miss Graves. He didn't say anything to anyone. He just went out to the north field, and he was there most of the afternoon." Clara thought about that. "All right," she said. Samuel didn't leave. He stood in the doorway a moment longer, the cold coming in around him. "You know she can have you removed?" he said. "Eleanor, she's done it before. Girl who came 2 winters ago tried to reorganize the dairy stores without asking. Gone in a week." "I know," Clara said. "Doesn't worry you." She looked at him then. "Of course it worries me, Mr. Carter. I have nowhere to go." She said it simply, without drama, the way you state a weather fact. "But I have numbers that show this estate will be in serious trouble by midwinter if nothing changes. And I'm not willing to stay quiet about that, because Eleanor Graves doesn't like the way I delivered the information." Samuel Carter looked at her for a long moment. Then he put his hat back on. "Well," he said, "don't let the soup burn." He walked away. 2 days later, William Harrington came to the east kitchen. Clara heard his horse before she saw him. She had developed in the past weeks a fine-tuned awareness of all the sounds of this property, the rhythms of it, the way you learned the sounds of a house you'd lived in for years. She heard the particular gait of the gray gelding he favored, and she set down the jar she was sealing and straightened without hurrying. He knocked, which surprised her. In her experience, men who owned the property didn't knock on doors within it. She opened the door. House was taller than she'd expected, and thinner, the kind of thin that came from forgetting to eat rather than not having enough. Mid-40s, she guessed. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A face that had been handsome and was still good-looking in the way that hard weather and harder grief carved a face into something with more edges than it started with. He was looking at her shelves before he was fully through the door. "Mr. Harrington," she said. "Miss Whitmore." He stepped inside and stopped taking in the room the way she had taken in his estate on her first morning, reading it, absorbing it. His eyes moved across the full shelves, the hanging herbs, the organized stores, the notebook open on the shelf. He looked at it all for a long, quiet moment. Then he said, "You wrote that the main supply order was insufficient for a hard winter." "Yes, sir. Eleanor tells me the order is what it's always been, and there's no reason to change it." "The order is what it's always been when the roads stayed open all winter," Clara said. "I don't believe the roads will stay open all winter this year." He looked at her. "What makes you say that?" "The way the cold came in," she said. "The direction of it, the timing. The old-timers I've spoken with say this pattern comes every 12 to 15 years. The last time it happened like this, the South Road closed in December and didn't open until March." You've been talking to the hands about weather patterns. I've been talking to the hands about everything, she said evenly. They know this land better than any supply ledger does. Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, not quite surprise. Something quieter than either. Show me, he said. The numbers you wrote about. She handed him the notebook without hesitation. She had kept the relevant pages clear and organized precisely because she had hoped for this moment, had prepared for it, without letting herself rely on it. He stood at the work table and read in silence. She went back to the stove and kept working because standing still waiting for judgment was something she had decided long ago she wasn't going to do. He read for several minutes. He turned pages. He went back and reread something. She heard him move, heard him turn another page. Then he was quiet for long enough that she looked up. He was staring at the page that showed the current rate of spoilage in the main storage. The numbers she had documented carefully without touching anything, just observing and recording, because she didn't have authorization to touch anything in the main stores, and she hadn't taken it. This is the root cellar, he said. Yes. You documented all of this. Yes. You didn't fix it. I didn't have authorization to touch anything in the main stores, she said. So I didn't. He looked up at her then. Really looked at her, she felt, for the first time. Not as a woman who had arrived with nothing and been sent to the back kitchen. As something else. She wasn't sure what yet, and she didn't let herself hope toward it. Why didn't you go to Eleanor with this? He asked. Clara held his gaze. Because I judged that the information would not reach you if I did. Another silence. Longer this time. That's a serious accusation, he said. It's not an accusation, she said quietly. It's an observation. I could be wrong. I've been wrong before. But I wasn't willing to gamble this estate's winter food supply on the chance that I was wrong about that particular thing. William Harrington looked at her for a moment longer. Then he looked down at the notebook again. The smokehouse, he said. You've restarted it. With Mr. Carter's help, yes. I wasn't informed of that. No, she agreed. I made a decision to use existing estate resources that were lying idle. If that was outside my authority, I'm prepared to hear it. She said it calmly. But she meant it. If he told her to stop, she would stop. She would stop, and she would watch the opportunity pass, and she would live with that, and still get up the next morning and do what she could with what she had. She had not come here to fight anyone's battles. She had come here to do a job. He didn't tell her to stop. He closed the notebook. He set it back on the shelf with a care that surprised her, a deliberate, respectful gesture like you handled something that mattered. I'll review the supply order, he said. Thank you, she said. He moved toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked at the shelves one more time. All those jars, all that careful work, all those weeks of early mornings and late nights accumulated in rows on the shelves of a kitchen everyone had written off. How long have you been doing this? He asked. Not the kitchen, she understood he meant all of it. The planning, the documenting, the knowing how to read a season. All my life, she said. He nodded once and left. Eleanor Graves found out about the visit by the end of the day. Clara knew because the temperature around the main house dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the weather, and because two of the housegirls who had started stopping by the East Kitchen for midday food, quietly without Eleanor's knowledge, stopped coming, and because Eleanor herself appeared again this time in the early evening, not in the doorway, but fully inside, standing on Clara's clean floor, with her coat still buttoned like she didn't intend to stay. You went behind my back, Eleanor said. I delivered information to the owner of this estate, Clara said. She was washing jars. She kept washing them. You undermined my authority. I shared documented facts about the estate's winter preparation with the man who is responsible for this estate. She set a jar on the drying rack, picked up another. I understand that may feel like the same thing to you. It isn't. Eleanor stepped closer. Her voice dropped, and it was somehow colder, quieter. I've managed this estate for 4 years. I've kept it running through William's grief, through staff turnover, through 2 hard springs and 1 drought. I know what this place needs. Then you know the road will likely close early this year, Clara said. And you know what the supply order looks like right now. Silence. "The order is adequate," Eleanor said. But there was the smallest hesitation before it, just a fraction of a second, and Clara heard it. "Then we agree to disagree," Clara said, "and Mr. Harrington can decide which assessment he trusts." Eleanor looked at her with something that was past anger, past contempt, into a territory that was colder and more strategic than either. "You think he'll choose you," Eleanor said. "A woman who arrived a month ago with a trunk and an old recipe book." Clara set down the jar she was holding. She turned to face Eleanor directly. "I think he'll choose the numbers," she said. "They're not mine. They're the estate's. I just wrote them down." Eleanor left. Clara stood at the work table for a moment after the door closed and let herself feel privately and briefly the full weight of where she was. She had no allies in the main house. She had Samuel Carter, who was loyal to the estate, but not to her, and Pete, who was 19 and kind, but had his own position to protect. She had Eleanor Graves as a determined enemy, and she had William Harrington as an unknown quantity. A man she had spoken to once, who had listened to her and then gone away and not yet shown which direction he would move. She was in the most practical sense alone. But the shelves were full, and the snow that had been threatening all week finally began falling outside the window, small and steady and absolutely serious, and Clara looked at it and thought, there it is. Right on time, just like she'd told him. She hoped he'd noticed. 3 days after the snow began. William Harrington revised the supply order. Clara didn't hear about it directly. She heard about it from Pete, who heard about it from the wagon driver, who had received the revised list with undisguised shock because it was nearly double the staple quantities and included 3 additional crates of preservation supplies. Salt wax, muslin crocking jars that Clara had listed specifically in her note as critical. Eleanor Graves did not come to the East Kitchen after that. What she did instead was more dangerous. Clara began to notice in the way you notice things when you're paying attention, small frictions. Twice the wood delivery that was supposed to come to the East Kitchen stove was delayed without explanation and had to be fetched manually from the barn. The provision of basic kitchen supplies, flour, oil, salt that had been Clara's to draw on, freely began requiring a written request submitted to the main house, and twice her requests came back approved 3 days late, which in a working kitchen was the difference between bread today and bread on Thursday. Nothing dramatic. Nothing she could point to and name as deliberate interference. Just friction. Just the steady, quiet grinding of small obstacles placed in her path by someone who knew exactly how to make life difficult without leaving fingerprints. Clara adapted. She stockpiled her own basics bought ahead. She adjusted her timing. She found that Pete, who made daily trips to the storage barn, could bring her wood on those runs without anyone thinking twice about it. She worked around every obstacle. She did not complain to William Harrington. She would not do that. She would not be the woman who ran to the owner with petty grievances about the estate manager. That was a losing game. And more than that, it was beneath what she was trying to do here. She was not trying to defeat Eleanor Graves. She was trying to keep this estate fed through winter. She kept her head down. She kept working. And then the thing happened that changed everything. The thing that Clara had not planned for and could not have, because it came from a direction she hadn't been watching. It came from the main house. From a room on the second floor late on a Friday night when most of the estate was asleep. It came in the form of a woman's crying, and Clara, who slept lightly, and whose east kitchen was downwind of the main house, heard it faintly through the stone wall. The kind of crying that had been going on a long time and had gotten very quiet, because the person doing it had stopped caring whether anyone heard. She lay still and listened and tried to understand what she was hearing. Not Eleanor. The sound was coming from the wrong direction for Eleanor's rooms. She got up. She put on her coat. She went outside. She stood in the cold yard and listened, and the sound was coming from the second-floor window on the south side of the main house, a window she knew from her mental map of the building to be adjacent to the room that had been Margaret Harrington's sitting room. Clara went back inside. She made tea. Strong hot with the dried chamomile she had hanging from the rafters, and she sweetened it with a small spoonful of the honey she kept for exactly the kind of night where something sweet and warm was what a person needed and didn't know how to ask for. She went back to the main house. She knocked at the servants' entrance. The young girl who opened it, barely 16, startled, wrapped in a shawl over her nightgown, looked at Clara like she was something impossible. "I have tea," Clara said simply, "for whoever needs it upstairs." The girl blinked. Then she opened the door wider. Clara climbed the stairs. She didn't know what she'd find. She prepared herself for Eleanor for some private crisis that Eleanor would never forgive her for witnessing. She prepared herself for the possibility that she had entirely misread the situation and was about to make everything worse. She knocked at the sitting room door. A long pause. Then William Harrington said, "Come in." She opened the door. He was sitting in the chair by the cold fireplace. He was not crying. He looked like he had been, or was close to it, or had been somewhere adjacent to it, that was just as hard. His coat was still on. He had something in his hand. She recognized it only when she came closer. A small photograph. A woman from the style of it gone some years now. He looked at Clara. Clara set the tea on the table beside him. "It's chamomile," she said. "And a little honey. It helps." She turned to leave. "She would have liked you," he said. Clara stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. She gave the words a moment, the way you gave a flame a moment, before you cupped your hand around it. "Margaret," he said, "she would have had you in the main kitchen from the first day. She would have been in here every morning asking what was in the soup." His voice was quiet and rough and steady, all at once the voice of someone who had said the name often enough in private that it didn't break him to say it, but still cost him something. Clara turned then. "She sounds like a woman who knew what mattered," she said. William looked at this photograph. "She did." A pause. "I forgot for a while. What mattered?" Clara didn't fill the silence. She had learned that some silences were the most important part of a conversation, and the best thing you could do was let them breathe. "The supply order," he said finally. "I should have been watching those numbers all along. I should have been paying attention." "You're paying attention now," she said. He looked up at her. "Is it enough what we've ordered? Is it enough to get us through?" She considered lying, considered softening it, decided against both. "It's better than it was," she said. "If the winter is average, yes. If it's hard," she paused. "I need 3 more weeks of good preservation work. And I need access to the main root cellar to reorganize the existing stores." He was quiet for a moment. "Eleanor hasn't authorized that." "No," Clara said. "She hasn't." Another silence. He looked at the photograph, then at the cup of tea, then at the window where the snow was still falling. "She will," he said. "By tomorrow." Clara nodded. "Thank you." She left him to the cold fireplace and the photograph and the tea. She was halfway down the stairs when she heard something that made her stop. Voices low from the direction of the downstairs sitting room. Eleanor's voice. And another woman's, one of the house girls, the older one who ran messages. Clara stood still on the stair. She couldn't hear the words. Just the tone, Eleanor's voice low and controlled and sharp as a blade edge, the house girl's voice murmuring compliance. Then silence. Clara moved on down the stairs and out the servants' entrance and back across the yard to the east kitchen. She put more wood on the stove. She sat at the work table and opened her notebook. She wrote for a long time. Not plans, she had plans. What she wrote was a precise, detailed accounting of everything she had done since arriving at Blackwood Ridge, every resource she had identified, and acted on every preservation she had completed, every number she had tracked. She wrote it like a legal document, clear-dated, sourced, complete. She didn't know yet exactly why she was writing it, but she knew Eleanor Graves had been in that sitting room at midnight, and she knew the topic of that conversation was almost certainly Clara Whitmore, and she knew that the access to the root cellar that William had promised would be coming through Eleanor to get to her, which meant it would be slow and conditional and arrived with strings attached. She was not going to wait for it passively. She was going to be ready for whatever came next. Outside, the snow was still falling. It had been falling for 3 days without stopping. The road south, Clara noted without surprise, would be impassable by morning, right on time. She closed the notebook. She went to the shelf and counted the jars again. Not because she didn't know the number, but because the counting was its own kind of steadiness. Her hands moved along the row, touching each one. Carrots, parsnips, beans, tomatoes put up from the last of the summer stores she'd found. Smoked beef, rendered fat, dried herbs, pickled cabbage from the heads she'd pulled from the forgotten garden before the ground froze. 41 jars. Not enough. But more than anyone expected. And more than there would have been if she'd done what Eleanor Graves had intended, if she'd made porridge for 6 field hands every morning and stayed out of everyone's way and been small and grateful and invisible. She turned off the lantern. She lay down in the dark, still cold at the edges, even with the fire going, and she thought about William Harrington's face in that chair by the cold fireplace. The way he'd said she would have liked you. Not as a compliment meant to make her feel better. As a simple fact that had cost him something to say out loud. She thought about Eleanor's voice in the sitting room at midnight. She thought about the road closing. She thought about how much needed to happen in the next 3 weeks before winter dug in completely. Then she closed her eyes and made herself sleep, because tomorrow she would need everything she had, and she had learned long ago that the most practical thing a person could do in the face of a hard thing coming was to rest while they still could. The access to the root cellar came through the next afternoon, just as William had said it would. It came in a note from Eleanor, 3 lines terse, as a telegram, authorizing Clara to enter and reorganize the main cold stores, under the condition that all changes be documented and reported to the estate office. The condition was fine. Clara had been documenting everything from the beginning. She walked into the main root cellar for the first time at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Samuel Carter behind her with a lamp. She stopped in the doorway. Samuel stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "How long has it been like this?" she said finally. "Like I said," Samuel said. 3 years of no one paying proper attention. The stores were significant. Blackwood Ridge was a large estate, and it had real resources. But they were organized with a carelessness that made Clara's hands itch. Root vegetables stored against the wrong wall where the temperature fluctuated. Preserved goods stacked in ways that made it impossible to use the oldest stock first. 3 full barrels of salted pork stored in the wrong position, their lids not properly sealed, already beginning to turn. A sack of cornmeal that had been wet and dried and was no longer safe. She moved through it methodically. Samuel holding the lamp, and she called out what was good, what needed immediate use, what could be saved with intervention, and what needed to be discarded. And Samuel wrote it down in his careful, slow hand, because she was moving too fast to write and assess at the same time. By the time they came out 2 hours later, they had the full picture. It was better than she'd feared, and worse than she'd hoped. The estate had resources. What it had lacked was management. She could work with resources and management. That was at its simplest what she did. "We need 4 people," she told Samuel, "to reorganize and reseal the pork barrels today before we lose more of it. Can you get me 4 people?" "I can get you Pete and 2 of the fence crew," Samuel said. "Third's out sick." "3 is enough," she said. "Tell them there's hot soup after." Samuel almost smiled. Almost. "Yes, ma'am," he said. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening. 4 people in the cold root cellar, moving and sorting and resealing and documenting. And Clara moved among them like she'd been managing stores all her life, because she had, and she talked them through each step, not with commands, but with explanations, because she wanted them to understand what they were doing and why, because the day might come when she wasn't there, and they'd need to know it themselves. Pete, hauling a barrel across to the correct wall, looked at her sideways and said, "Miss Whitmore, you're not like any cook I've ever met." "I'm not just a cook," she said. "I never was." He thought about that. "What are you then?" She handed him the lid for the barrel. "I'm the person keeping you fed this winter," she said. "Press that down hard and make sure it seats properly." He pressed it down hard, and somewhere above them, in the main house, Eleanor Graves was reading the note that the wagon driver had brought back from town. The note that told her what Clara already knew, and had been preparing for the South Road, had been declared impassable by the county agent, and there was no timeline for reopening. The winter had arrived, officially, finally, completely. And the question that was now settled beyond argument was whether Blackwood Ridge Estate was ready for it. Clara climbed out of the root cellar as the last light left the sky, and she stood in the cold yard with dirt on her hands and her back aching, and her mind already 3 steps ahead, calculating what needed to happen tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. She looked at the east kitchen chimney, her fire still burning. She looked at the main house windows yellow with lamplight. She thought about 41 jars, plus what was now properly organized in the root cellar, plus the smoked stores in the smokehouse, plus the grain. She had carefully tracked and knew to be sufficient if managed correctly. It might be enough. It would have to be enough. Because the road was closed and there was no one coming. And what this estate survived on this winter, it would survive on what was already here. What she had already built. She went back into the kitchen and fed the fire and started the soup for morning, and her hands moved through the familiar work with the ease of long practice, and somewhere between the measuring and the stirring, she made a decision that she hadn't fully made before a quiet internal shift that she didn't announce to anyone and didn't need to. She was not leaving Blackwood Ridge. Not because she had nowhere to go, though she didn't. Not because she was afraid of what came next. But because this kitchen, this broken-down, abandoned, nobody-wanted-it kitchen, had become something she recognized. It had become a place that was hers. Not because anyone had given it to her. Because she had built it piece by piece, hour by hour, in the cold and the dark, with no one watching, and no one approving, and no one expecting her to succeed. She was not leaving, and the winter was just beginning. The morning the temperature dropped 20 degrees overnight, Clara was already awake. She had felt it coming, the way she felt most things, not as a thought, but as a physical certainty, something in her chest that registered change before her mind caught up with it. She was at the stove before 4, feeding the fire, listening to the wind that had shifted direction sometime in the night, and was now hitting the stone walls of the east kitchen from the northwest, with a sound like something that meant business. She put the water on. She started the bread. And then she stood at the work table and opened her notebook to the page she had titled, Simply January Count, and she ran the numbers she had been running every 3rd day since the road closed. The numbers were holding. Barely, and with conditions, but holding. The root cellar reorganization had saved more than she'd expected. The pork barrels they'd resealed in time were intact, and the repositioned root vegetables were staying clean and firm, where before they'd been softening and turning at the edges. The smokehouse was producing steadily. The east kitchen shelves, which she restocked every week with fresh preserved goods from whatever the estate's remaining stores could yield, were full enough that she allowed herself a small private exhale each time she counted them. But it was January now. Proper January, the kind Montana didn't apologize for. And what the numbers told her, if she was being honest with herself, and she was always honest with herself, was that the next 6 weeks would determine everything. She closed the notebook. She heard the knock at the door before she heard footsteps, which meant whoever it was had moved through the yard fast and quiet. She opened it and found Samuel Carter on the step, and even in the poor light before dawn, she could read his face well enough by now to know that something had happened. "What is it?" she said. "Garrison's family," he said. Garrison was one of the senior ranch hands, 20 years on the estate. A big, quiet man with a wife and 2 young children who lived in the workers' cottage at the edge of the east property. "The boy is sick. Came on last night. High fever." Clara was already reaching for her coat. "Has anyone sent for a doctor?" "Road's closed," Samuel said. "I know the road's closed," she said. "I'm asking if anyone tried." "Tom Briggs volunteered to ride out this morning. Mr. Harrington told him to wait until daylight and see how bad the snow is." Clara pulled her coat on. "Has Mrs. Garrison eaten anything today?" "I don't think any of them slept last night." She moved to the stove, lifted the pot of broth she had kept simmering since midnight. She always kept broth going in deep winter. It cost almost nothing, and was ready for exactly this kind of moment, and she filled a large jar, sealed it tight, wrapped it in a cloth. She added a smaller jar of the dried ginger and honey mixture she kept for illness, and a half loaf of the morning bread that was almost done. "Take this now," she said. "I'll follow in 10 minutes." Samuel took the bundle without argument and went. Clara finished the bread, pulled it from the oven, wrapped it, and went out into the kind of cold that hit you in the lungs like a fist. She got to the Garrison cottage to find the mother, a pale, exhausted woman named Ruth. who had the look of someone who had been holding herself together through sheer force of will for approximately 12 hours, sitting at the bedside of a boy of about 7, who was indeed feverish cheeks, scarlet, breathing too fast and too shallow. Clara assessed quickly. Not croup. Not the deep chest rattle she feared most. Fever, yes, serious, but not yet dangerous if they acted. "Has he kept anything down?" she asked Ruth. "A little water this morning, nothing else." Clara opened the broth jar. "This goes in him a spoonful at a time every few minutes as long as he'll take it. Don't rush it. Small amounts steady." She showed Ruth the ginger honey mixture. "This goes in warm water, not hot warm, and you give it to him 3 times today." She looked at the boy. "What's his name?" "James," Ruth whispered. "James." Clara said the name directly to the boy, who opened his eyes a fraction. "I'm going to make you better. But you have to drink what your mother gives you. Can you do that?" The boy looked at her with the glassy, too wide eyes of a child with fever, and he said very quietly, "Yes, ma'am." "Good," she said. She stayed for an hour. She showed Ruth how to cool the compress without shocking him. She sat with the boy while Ruth ate the bread, because Ruth hadn't eaten since yesterday, and a woman who collapsed from exhaustion couldn't care for her sick child. She answered Ruth's questions as steadily and honestly as she could, which meant not making promises she couldn't keep, but also not feeding the fear that was already there and doing no good. When she left, Ruth caught her hand at the door. "Thank you," Ruth said. It came out rough, like it had been sitting in her throat for a while. "He'll be all right," Clara said. And she believed it. She had watched enough childhood fevers come and go to know the difference between this and something truly dangerous. "Feed him the broth. Keep him warm. I'll come back this evening." She walked back across the yard in the bitter morning. She did not see William Harrington standing at the window of the main house watching her cross the yard until she was almost back to the east kitchen. When she looked up by chance, he was there, just standing watching. He lifted his hand, a small gesture, barely a wave, more like an acknowledgement. She nodded and went inside. She was back at her stove, back at her bread, back at her notebook, and she thought about Ruth Garrison's face, the way a person looked when they had been alone with fear all night with no help coming. And then something changed. That expression. She knew that expression from the inside. She'd worn it herself more times than she could count. She thought about that for 1 minute. Then she went back to work. By midday, word had traveled the estate, the way it always did, not through any announcement, not through Eleanor Graves's office, but through the invisible network of people who lived and worked in close quarters and shared information. The way blood shared oxygen automatically and without needing to be told to. The cook from the east kitchen went to the Garrison cottage this morning and saved the boy. That was not precisely what had happened, but Clara understood that precision was not the point of how stories moved through a community. The point was, she went. She had what was needed. The boy was better. Pete found her at 2 in the afternoon, ostensibly to bring more wood, but really she could tell because he needed to say something. "Mrs. Garrison told her husband," he said. "And Tom Briggs heard it from Garrison, and now everyone's talking about it." "It's not a story," Clara said. "It's a sick child who needed broth and a cool cloth." "Yes, ma'am." He set the wood down. "But people are saying—" He stopped, started again. "People are saying you've been keeping this place together. Not just the food, all of it." Clara looked at him. He was 19 and earnest, and he meant every word, and it made her feel something warm and also cautious, because she knew that this kind of talk meant kindly could become a very sharp edge, depending on who else heard it. "I've been doing my job," she said. "So has everyone else, including you." Pete nodded. But he didn't look entirely satisfied with the answer, and she understood why. Sometimes people needed to name a thing, even if the person being named would rather they didn't. She would worry about that later. Right now, she had more bread to make, and 3 more jars to process, and a calculation to run on the grain stores that she'd been putting off because she wasn't entirely sure she'd like the answer. She didn't like the answer. The grain calculation came up short, not catastrophically, not by a margin that meant starvation, but by enough that if the winter ran long, if they were still locked in by mid-March. The way Samuel's old-timers said sometimes happened, they would need to make some hard decisions about how the remaining grain was allocated. She sat with that number for a while. Then she went to find William Harrington. She had learned over the past weeks something about the way he moved through his days, the rhythms of him, the places he went when he was working and when he was not, the hours when he was reachable and the hours when he was somewhere inside himself that she didn't try to interrupt. She had never gone to the main house to seek him out before. She had always let him come to her or sent information through Pete. But this was not a message through Pete situation. She knocked at the door of his study, a room she had not been in. She knew where it was because she knew where everything on this estate was. Now the way you knew a house you'd lived in long enough, even if you'd never been invited into every room. "Come in," he said. She opened the door. Howe was at his desk, which was covered in papers and ledgers, in the organized disorder of a man who understood his own system even if nobody else could. He looked up when she entered, and didn't look surprised to see her, which she took as a good sign. "The grain," she said without preamble, because she had learned that he preferred it that way. "We're going to be short if the winter runs past mid-March." He set down his pen. "How short?" "About 3 weeks short at current consumption. I can reduce consumption by adjusting the bread ratios more. Cornmeal less wheat flour, and that buys us maybe 10 days. But I wanted you to know the number before I changed anything." He was quiet for a moment. "What are the options?" "3, she said. "Reduce portion sizes for the full estate staff and workers. Adjust the ratios like I said without reducing portions. Or identify additional sources I haven't found yet." She paused. "There's a 4th option, but I'm not recommending it." "What is it?" "Ration the workers more aggressively and protect the main house supply. Some estates do it that way." He looked at her sharply. "That's not how this estate works." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm not recommending it." The look he gave her then was brief but substantial, the look of a man recalibrating something. "The ratio adjustment," he said. "Do it. And tell me if there's anything else that can be found." "I'd like permission to search the outlying barns," she said. "The 2 on the north property that haven't been used since autumn. I've been told there may be stored items from the summer harvest that were put there and not logged." "Told by who?" "Mr. Carter." William nodded. "Take whoever you need. Take Carter." She turned to go. "Miss Whitmore." She stopped. "The Garrison boy," he said. "How is he this morning?" She turned back. "Better. Fever broke around dawn. He'll be fine." Something in William's face shifted, something he probably didn't intend to show, but that she could read anyway, because she had been paying attention to him for 2 months now, and she understood more of his expressions than he likely realized. "Good," he said. Just the one word, but it carried weight. She went back to her kitchen. The north barn search happened the following morning. Clara and Samuel and Pete, with a lamp each, and the cold biting hard enough that breath fogged visibly in the barn's interior. What they found made Clara stop in the middle of the floor and take one long breath. Stored grain. 3 substantial sacks of oats that had been put in the north barn in September when the main barn ran out of space, and then in the chaos of transition between summer and autumn, staffing simply forgotten. Not logged. Not mentioned. Just sitting there in the cold and the dark, perfectly preserved, because the cold had kept everything exactly as it was. She looked at Samuel. He looked at her. 3 weeks, she said. Maybe 4 if we manage carefully. Yes, Samuel said. It was not a dramatic moment. It was just a barn with forgotten grain, and 2 people who understood exactly what it meant. But Clara felt it anyway, that thing that lives right alongside relief and isn't quite the same as it. Closer to vindication. The feeling of having been right to keep looking when stopping would have been easier. Pete was already doing the math on his fingers. He looked up. "That means we're fine." "It means we have room to breathe," Clara corrected. "Not the same thing. We manage carefully and we're fine. We get careless and we're not." She looked at him steadily. "We don't get careless." "No, ma'am," he said. They got the grain back to the proper stores before noon. Clara adjusted her calculations, wrote the new numbers in her notebook with the date and the source, and felt the small, satisfying click of a plan holding together under pressure. She did not feel it long. That evening, just as the light was giving out and she was banking the fire for the night, Eleanor Graves appeared at her door. Not the controlled, deliberate Eleanor of their previous confrontations. Something different. Eleanor was still composed. She was always composed. It seemed to be physically impossible for her not to be, but there was something underneath the composure, something with sharp edges pressing up against the inside of it. "I need to speak with you," Eleanor said. "Come in," Clara said. She didn't move from where she was standing. She noted that Eleanor came all the way inside and closed the door behind her, which was new. "There are rumors," Eleanor said, "among the staff." "There are always rumors," Clara said. "These are specific." Eleanor looked at her with those Winter River eyes. "They're saying you've become the actual manager of this estate, that you're making decisions above my authority, that you've spoken with Mr. Harrington privately on multiple occasions about estate matters." "I've shared relevant information with the estate's owner," Clara said. "That's not the same as managing the estate. People see you going to the main house. They see you coming back. They see the changes, the supplies, the stores, the smokehouse, and they're crediting you with those things." "People can see what they like," Clara said. "I can't control that." Eleanor stepped closer. Not threateningly, more like she was making herself commit to the conversation rather than standing at its edge. "What do you want?" Eleanor said. It came out strangely direct, stripped of the usual coldness. "That's what I'm trying to understand. You arrived here with nothing. You've worked harder than anyone I've ever placed in a position here. You haven't asked for more wages. You haven't demanded better quarters. You haven't tried to ingratiate yourself with the house staff. What is it you actually want?" Clara looked at her for a long moment. "I want this estate to be standing in the spring," she said. "With everyone in it fed and healthy and still here. That's all I want." Eleanor studied her face like she was looking for the lie in it. "That's all?" Clara said again. "I'm not after your position. I'm not trying to earn a place in the main house. I'm not interested in credit. I want the estate to survive the winter. That's the beginning and end of it." Eleanor was quiet for a moment that stretched out long enough to become uncomfortable. Then she said something that Clara had not expected, not from this woman, not ever. "I believe you," Eleanor said, slowly, like she was surprised to be saying it. Clara didn't respond immediately. She let the words settle. "Then we don't have a problem," she said quietly. Eleanor's expression was complicated, a woman recalibrating something old and fixed inside herself, which was never a comfortable process and showed on the face in unexpected ways. She nodded once, then she left. Clara stood at the stove for the moment after the door closed. She did not celebrate. She did not relax. Because Eleanor Graves saying "I believe you" in a private kitchen was a very different thing from Eleanor Graves's behavior in public and in the estate office, and in the small daily ways that management showed itself. The conversation might change things. It might change nothing. She would know which one it was by what happened next, and what happened next was always in the future. She banked the fire and went to bed. She was asleep quickly because she was tired in the deep, quiet way of someone who had been working without stopping, and she did not dream. What woke her was not a sound. It was a smell. She was on her feet before she was fully conscious, pulling her coat on, and she was out the door and reading the night air before she had a complete thought in her head. Smoke. Not her chimney. Too much smoke, too heavy, coming from the wrong direction. She ran. The storage barn. The main one. The one holding the bulk of the restocked winter supplies she had spent 2 months building had caught fire from a dropped lantern. She learned this later. In the moment she knew only that the north side of the building was burning, that 3 ranch hands were already there throwing buckets of ice water at the base of the flames, and that the supply room on the east side of the barn was not yet on fire and had maybe minutes before it was. She didn't stop. She went straight through the barn door. "Clara!" Samuel's voice shouting from behind her. She was already inside. She knew that barn. She knew exactly where every supply was stored because she had placed most of it herself or directed its placement. She moved through the smoke to the east storage room and she hauled. She hauled as fast as she could move, pulling sacks, rolling barrels, throwing wrapped parcels out the side door that Pete, who had followed her in without being told to, was catching and dragging clear of the building. The smoke thickened. Her eyes were streaming. She kept moving. "That's enough." Samuel at the door. "Get out, it's not worth it." "The salt," she shouted back. "I need the salt." The salt was irreplaceable. 200 pounds of it, the most critical preservation supply they had positioned in the far corner of the storage room. She got to it. It was in sacks heavy, and she couldn't move them alone. She turned and Pete was there already grabbing the other side, and they hauled the first sack between them to the door. Then the second. Then Samuel was inside too, age and bad back forgotten, hauling the third sack with a determination that Clara recognized because she felt it herself. The thing that took over when stopping wasn't an option. They got 4 of the 6 sacks out before the fire reached the main wall of the storage room, and Samuel dragged them both out bodily, his grip on Clara's arm absolute and non-negotiable. They stood outside in the freezing air and watched the barn burn. William Harrington arrived at a run 2 minutes later, coat unbuttoned, clearly pulled from sleep. He looked at the fire. He looked at the pile of salvaged supplies outside the door. He looked at Clara, who was covered in soot and coughing from the smoke and still on her feet. "Is everyone out?" he said. His voice was completely controlled. "Everyone out," Samuel confirmed. "No one hurt." William looked at the salvaged pile again. "You went in." It wasn't a question. "The salt," Clara said, still catching her breath. "We need it." He looked at her with something that was past surprise and past concern, and into a territory that had no clean name, the look of a man recalibrating something fundamental, and knowing it, and being helpless against it. "You went into a burning building for the salt," he said. "We can't preserve without it," she said simply. "We lose the salt, we lose the rest of the winter's preservation capacity. We lose that we're in trouble by February." A beat. 2. "You could have been killed," he said, and the careful control in his voice had frayed just at the edges. "Yes," she said, "but I wasn't." She turned to assess the salvage pile. "I need to get this moved to the east kitchen storage before the cold takes it. The smoke might have gotten into some of the sacks." She started moving. She heard him say behind her very quietly, something she thought was probably not meant for her to hear. Something that sounded like "God Almighty, woman." She kept moving. The rest of that night was logistics moving. The salvaged supplies, assessing the damage to the barn, determining what had been lost and what had been saved and what the implications were for their winter stores. Clara ran the new numbers in the east kitchen at 3 in the morning with Samuel beside her and Pete keeping the fire going, and when she was done, she set down the pencil and sat back and looked at what they had. They had lost some. Not everything. Enough remained that the plan held reduced tightened, requiring more careful management than before, but holding. "We'll need to stretch harder," she said. "Another 5% reduction in bread portions. I can make up the shortfall with the parsnip flour I've been preparing. It's not wheat, but it'll fill the bread out. Nobody will notice." "They'll notice," Samuel said. "They'll notice it tastes different," she said. "They won't notice they're hungry. There's a difference." She looked at her numbers again. "We're all right. This is manageable." Samuel looked at her for a long moment. In the months since she'd arrived, she had learned his silences the way you learned any language you were immersed in, what they meant, how to read them. This one meant something he was struggling to put into words, which was unusual for a man who generally only said what he could express precisely. Finally he said, "My wife. She died 15 years ago. Fever. Way out here, road closed, nothing to be done." He said it flat and clean, the way old grief got said when it had been held long enough. "I stayed on this estate because it was all I had left. And then it started coming apart, and I stayed because it was all I had left. But it's been a long time since I thought it was going to be all right." He looked at her directly. "I think it's going to be all right." Clara held his gaze. "It is," she said. "Get some sleep, Mr. Carter." He got up. He was at the door when he turned back. "You know," he said, "Eleanor Graves told William when you first arrived that you'd be gone in a week. Told him you were a desperate woman with nothing to offer and he shouldn't waste resources on you." Clara was quiet. He told her to let you stay anyway. Samuel paused. Thought you should know that. He went out into the cold. Clara sat with that for a moment. The image of William Harrington, a man deep in his own grief, a man who barely seemed to be inhabiting his own estate, saying let her stay anyway about a woman he'd never met, based on nothing but a plain letter listing what she could do. She didn't know what to do with that exactly. So she filed it away, the way she filed most things that mattered, but needed time to mean something, and she went back to her numbers. The fire had changed something on the estate. Not the material damage. The barn would be rebuilt in spring, and the lost supplies were painful but survivable. What changed was something less tangible and more important. People had watched Clara Whitmore run into a burning building for the estate's salt supply. You could not pay for that kind of moment. It was not a thing you could arrange or perform. Either you went in or you didn't, and what you chose in that second told everyone watching something true about you that no amount of kitchen management or supply ledgers could have communicated. In the days after the fire, something shifted in the way people moved around Clara. Not deference exactly, more like recognition. The ranch hands who had been politely grateful for the breakfast soup began stopping by at other times. Not always for food, but sometimes just to check in, to mention something they'd noticed, to ask her opinion on a thing. Tom Briggs, who had barely spoken to her since she arrived, came by on a Thursday morning to tell her that the ice on the North Pond was deep enough to cut if they wanted additional cold storage capacity, a fact she had not known and immediately put to use. Ruth Garrison brought 24 eggs from the family's hens and left them at the east kitchen door with a note that said simply, "For whatever you need them for." The eggs went into the week's baking. The baking went to everyone. That was the rhythm Clara had built. Everything that came in went back out in a form that could sustain someone, and nothing was withheld, and nothing was wasted. And this principle that she had operated by since childhood, that she had never needed to make into a philosophy, because to her it was just common sense, was apparently striking the people of Blackwood Ridge Estate as something remarkable. She didn't entirely understand that, but she accepted it. What she did not accept, what she refused quietly and completely, was the version of events that began circulating in the second week of January, in which Clara Whitmore was a kind of miraculous figure who had appeared and saved the estate by some combination of goodness and special ability. She heard this version from Pete, who meant well. "I'm not miraculous," she told him with more heat than she usually put into a correction. "I'm organized. There's a difference, and it matters. What I've done here, anyone could have done if they'd paid attention and been willing to work. Don't make it something it isn't." Pete looked slightly chastened. "Yes, ma'am." "Miraculous means it can't be learned," she said. "That's not a compliment. That's a way of excusing everyone else from trying. I thought about that." "Yes, ma'am," he said again, differently this time. She went back to her bread. She did not know that 3 miles away, on the other side of the ridge, the Harmon estate, smaller than Blackwood Ridge, less well provisioned, managed by people who had not had a Clara Whitmore or a Samuel Carter, was already in serious trouble. She would learn this the following week, when the Harmon foreman managed to ride through the drifts to reach Blackwood Ridge and knock hat in hand at the main house door. She did not know it yet. What she knew was that it was still January, still the deep hard part of winter, and there was still a long way to go. She looked at her shelves. She counted the jars. She ran the numbers. And then she got up and made more soup, because the morning crew would be in from the east field in an hour, and they would need something hot, and she had exactly what they needed, and she was not going to be the thing that let them down. The fire in the east kitchen stove burned clean and steady. Outside, the snow came down. Inside, the kitchen, that nobody had wanted, kept feeding every single person on Blackwood Ridge Estate, one day at a time, through the hardest winter in 20 years. And Clara Whitmore stood at the center of it, sleeves rolled up, hands in the dough, entirely in her element. Entirely where she was supposed to be. The Harmon foreman's name was Dale Wicks, and he arrived at Blackwood Ridge on a Tuesday morning looking like a man who had swallowed his pride so hard it was still going down. How was 40-something weathered with the kind of face that had spent decades outdoors and showed every year of it. He stood in the main house entry hall with his hat in both hands and melting snow, dropping from his coat onto Eleanor Graves's clean floor, and he told William Harrington that the Harmon estate had 11 days of food left. Clara was not in that meeting. She heard about it from Pete, who had been standing near enough to the study door to catch most of it, and who came to the East Kitchen at a near run with the news, because he understood by now that Clara was the person who needed to know things first. She listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she asked 2 questions. How many people on the Harmon property? 14 workers and their families, Pete said. Maybe 24 people total. And what do they have left? Grain, some, not much else. They ran short on preservation supplies back in October and never restocked before the road closed. Clara turned to her shelves. She looked at them for a long moment. All that careful work, all those months of building and counting and managing down to the last ounce. She did the math in her head the way she always did, fast and without sentiment. Then she went to find William Harrington. She found him in the study, still with Dale Wicks, the 2 men sitting across from each other with the specific uncomfortable posture of a conversation that had reached the point where something had to be decided, and nobody wanted to be the one to decide it. Clara knocked on the open door, and both men looked up. I heard, she said to William. Can I speak? He nodded, and something in the small speed of that nod told her he had been waiting for her to appear. She came in and stood at the edge of the desk and looked at Dale Wicks directly. Mr. Wicks, I'm Clara Whitmore. I manage food and supply operations here. She said it plainly without looking at William to see if the description was accurate, because she had decided somewhere in the last month that it was accurate whether anyone had officially named it yet or not. Tell me exactly what you have left. Not estimates, specific quantities. Dale Wicks blinked. He had clearly not expected to be addressed by the cook. But something in Clara's voice, the particular tone of complete, unhurried authority that she had developed so gradually over the past months that she'd barely noticed it herself, made him answer without hesitation. He listed what they had. She listened, filed it, calculated. You don't have 11 days, she said when he finished. You have 7 if you reduce portions now, possibly 8. His jaw tightened. Our manager thought. Your manager was counting wrong, she said, not unkindly, but without softening it either. The way you've described the grain storage, you're losing 10 to 15% to moisture spoilage every week. That's not in his count. She looked at William. We can send provisions. Not enough to make them comfortable. We're managing our own margins, but enough to get them through. A week's supply for 24 people with instructions for stretching it. William looked at her. Can we spare it? We can spare enough, she said. Barely. I'll need to adjust our own bread ratios again and pull from the secondary stores, but yes, we can do it. Dale Wicks was staring at her with an expression she recognized, the expression of a man encountering something he didn't have a category for, and his existing categories were not bending easily to accommodate it. I don't, he started. Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but I came to speak with Mr. Harrington about— You came because your people are going to be hungry in a week, Clara said. The conversation you wanted to have and the conversation we need to have are the same conversation. How soon can you get a wagon through? A beat of silence. Then Dale Wicks looked at William, and William looked back at him with an expression that clearly said, Answer the woman. Tomorrow morning, Dale said, if the drift on the north cut has settled. Then be here at dawn, Clara said. I'll have it ready. She left the study and went back to the East Kitchen and started adjusting numbers. She worked through most of that night. Not because the math was complicated, the math was the easiest part of anything she did, but because the packing required care. You didn't just hand someone supplies and hope. You prepared them in a way that made the most of every ounce, that gave clear instructions for use, that accounted for the fact that whoever was cooking on the Harmon estate was not her and might not know what she knew. She wrote out 3 pages of instructions. Detailed, specific, written in plain language, with nothing assumed. How to stretch the grain. How to make the preserved vegetables go further. How to render the fat she was including into a form that could be used multiple ways. How to make bone broth from the scraps she was packing separately. She had learned from her father that the difference between giving someone fish and teaching them to fish was real and mattered, but there was a third option that people forgot: giving someone fish with written instructions on how to catch their own. At 4 in the morning, Samuel found her still at the work table. He looked at the packed supplies. He looked at her calculations. He sat down across from her and said nothing for a moment. "You're pulling from the secondary grain," he said finally. "Yes. That was our safety margin." "I know. If we hit a bad week." "Then we hit a bad week and we deal with it," she said. 24 people, Samuel, children. They didn't fail to prepare because they were careless. They failed because they didn't have someone paying attention in October. That's not a reason to let them go hungry in February. Samuel looked at her. He had the expression he got when he disagreed with her, but knew she was right anyway, which was a specific expression she had learned to recognize and appreciate because it meant he was honest. "All right," he said. "I'll need you to help me load the wagon at dawn." "I'll be there." He was. And so, unexpectedly, was William Harrington out in the pre-dawn cold sleeves rolled to the elbow, despite the temperature lifting and loading alongside Samuel and Pete and Clara, without a word about it being beneath him, without any indication that this was unusual for the owner of a major estate. Dale Wicks watched this with an expression that was difficult to decode. He had arrived at Blackwood Ridge expecting to beg. He was leaving with a loaded wagon and 3 pages of instructions and a debt he had no way to calculate. As the wagon pulled out of the yard, Dale reined in his horse and looked down at Clara. "I don't know what to say," he told her. "Don't say anything," she said. "Follow the instructions. Keep people fed. That's all." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he tipped his hat, a genuine gesture, nothing perfunctory about it, and rode out. Clara watched the wagon go. She felt the cold all the way through her coat in her fingers and her feet and the back of her neck. She felt the subtraction she had just made from their own reserves, the new thinness of the margin she now had to work within. She felt all of it clearly and without flinching. Then she went back inside and made breakfast. She did not know, could not have known that Dale Wicks on his way back to the Harmon estate stopped at the crossroads where 3 ranching families lived in adjacent properties and told them what he had seen at Blackwood Ridge, what the East Kitchen looked like, what the woman managing it had done, how the estate had come through the worst of winter, not by luck or by wealth, but by planning and by someone who understood food and resources and people in equal measure. She didn't know that story was spreading. She was too busy managing the next problem. The next problem arrived in the form of Eleanor Graves, who appeared at the East Kitchen door on Thursday morning with a ledger in her hand and an expression Clara had not seen on her before. Not the cold calculation of their early confrontations, not the controlled wariness of their later ones. Something harder to read, almost brittle. "I need to show you something," Eleanor said. Clara let her in. Eleanor set the ledger on the work table. It was the main estate accounts, the master supply ledger that Eleanor controlled, and that Clara had never had direct access to. Eleanor opened it to a page near the back and turned it so Clara could read it. Clara read. She read it twice. Then she set her hands flat on the table and looked up. "When did this start?" she asked. Her voice was very even. "October," Eleanor said. "Before you arrived." The page showed a pattern of supply orders that didn't match the estate's actual needs, quantities ordered at prices that were in several cases significantly above market rate from a single supplier in town who appeared in the accounts more than any other single vendor by a factor of 3. Clara looked at Eleanor. "This vendor, do you know him personally?" A pause. The longest pause Eleanor Graves had given her yet. "He's my brother-in-law," Eleanor said. Clara absorbed that. "Does Mr. Harrington know?" she asked. "No," Eleanor said. "He doesn't look at the accounts at that level of detail. He never has. He trusted me." The word trusted sat in the kitchen between them for a moment, carrying everything it meant. "Why are you showing me this?" Clara asked. Eleanor looked at her hands on the ledger. Something was happening in her face, the slow, difficult movement of a woman who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had finally set it down and was now feeling all the weight of having carried it. "Because you're going to find it anyway," Eleanor said. "You track everything. You notice everything. Sooner or later you are going to look at the main accounts against the supply deliveries and see that the numbers don't match." She looked up. I thought it was better if you heard it from me first." Clara looked at her for a long, steady moment. "How much?" she asked. Eleanor named a figure. It wasn't ruinous. It wasn't small either. Clara did the mental calculation of what that money could have bought in actual supplies, what the estate could have had coming into this winter if that money had gone where it was supposed to go. She felt a flare of anger, clean and hot and brief. Then it was gone because anger wasn't useful right now, and she needed to think. "What do you want me to do with this?" Clara asked. "I don't know," Eleanor said. And the honesty of it, the raw, unguarded honesty from a woman who had been armored every single moment since Clara arrived, was startling enough that Clara looked at her differently, as if seeing her for the first time. Eleanor Graves was not a villain. She was a woman who had found a way to keep herself secure in a position that was always precarious, who had let that security slip into something she couldn't justify, who had used her control of a grieving man's estate to protect herself. And it turned out, her family. She had made bad choices. She had made them for reasons that were human, if not defensible. Clara was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going to the main house with this today," she said finally. "I'm going to put it in my notebook and I'm going to think about it. That's all I can promise you right now." Eleanor nodded. She looked like a woman waiting for a sentence that had been delayed but not commuted. "Eleanor," Clara said, and it was the first time she had used the woman's first name. "The estate needs to know, not today, but eventually. You understand that?" Yes, Eleanor said quietly. "I understand." She took the ledger and left. Clara stood at her work table for a long time after the door closed. She was thinking about William Harrington in his study with all those papers. About the grief that had made him absent from his own life for years. About what it cost a person to trust, and what it cost them when that trust was used against them. She was also thinking about Eleanor Graves, who had come to her instead of burying it deeper. What that meant, and what it cost her to do it. She was not naive about power, about people, about the ways that institutions protected themselves and the people inside them protected themselves. She was not naive about the fact that what Eleanor had shown her was not a confession born purely of conscience. There was calculation in it too, the calculation of a woman who knew she was about to be found out and was choosing the terms of her exposure. But the calculation didn't make the honesty false. Both things could be true at the same time. Usually were. She opened her notebook. She wrote the date. She wrote what Eleanor had told her precisely and without editorializing. Then she closed the notebook and made bread. 3 days later, the thing she had not planned for happened. She was at the north garden fence. She checked it weekly, the one section of fence that had been repaired after the early snow collapsed part of it because she did not trust it in heavy drifts when she heard her name. Not called loudly, almost quietly, like someone who wasn't sure they had the right to say it. She turned. William Harrington was standing at the edge of the yard. He was not on horseback. He had walked out here, which meant he had come deliberately without the horse as a social buffer, which meant this was not a casual encounter. Can we talk?" he said. "Of course," she said. They walked back toward the east kitchen together, not speaking, and she was aware of the particular quality of his silence, not the comfortable quiet of Samuel Carter's silences, which she knew well by now, but something more effortful. Like a man choosing each step carefully. He stopped outside the east kitchen door. He didn't go in. "I looked at the supply ledger last night," he said. "The full ledger, for the first time in 2 years." Clara was very still. "I saw the vendor accounts," he said. "The pricing discrepancies." He was looking at the ground, then at the kitchen wall, then at her. "Did you know?" She had known for 3 days. She had been deciding every hour of those 3 days what to do about it. "Yes," she said. "Eleanor told me herself." His jaw tightened. "When?" "Thursday morning. 3 days ago." He processed that. "You didn't come to me." "No," she said. "I needed to think about how." He looked at her with something sharp and unsettled in his eyes. "How long has it been going on?" "Since October, from what Eleanor showed me. Possibly longer." He turned away from her, looked out at the white expanse of the property, and she could see in the set of his shoulders what this was costing him. Not just the money, she understood instinctively that the money was the smaller part of it. The larger part was the same thing it always was: trust. The specific, exhausting, irreversible grief of finding out that someone you trusted was not what you believed them to be. "She came to you," he said finally. "Not to me." "She knew I'd find it," Clara said. "She made a choice about the terms." "That's a generous reading of it." "Maybe," she said, "but it's an accurate one." He was quiet again. The wind pushed between them. "What do you think I should do?" he asked. She looked at him. He was asking her seriously, not deflecting, not looking for validation of a decision already made. Actually asking. "I think you should speak with her directly, privately, and hear what she has to say. All of it. And then I think you should decide what kind of man you want to be about it." She paused. "Those are two separate questions." He looked at her for a long moment. "The second one. What kind of man you want to be," she said quietly, "is not something I can answer for you." He nodded slowly. "No." A beat. "But you'd tell me if I was making a mistake." It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," she said, "I would." Something in his face shifted then, that thing that had been shifting in small increments since their first conversation in this kitchen, since the chamomile tea in the dark sitting room, since she'd walked out of a burning barn with salt on her hands. Something settling. "All right," he said. He went back to the main house. The conversation between William and Eleanor happened that afternoon. Clara was not present. She did not try to be. She heard the fragments of it that were audible through the estate's thin walls and wide corridors, not words, but the shape of it. The long silences. The low controlled register that people used when they were saying hard things without losing themselves. It lasted nearly 2 hours. What came out of it? She learned over the following days. Eleanor had agreed to full accounting of every discrepancy, repayment over time from her own wages, and a restructured role in which the supply ordering went through a process that William would now review directly. Eleanor had not been dismissed. This surprised people. It did not surprise Clara. She thought about it carefully when Pete, who was her most reliable information source, and knew it, brought her the news with undisguised bewilderment. "He's keeping her on," Pete said. "After all that." "She managed this estate through 4 years of a man who wasn't fully present," Clara said. "She made bad choices. She also kept this place running. Both things are true." She paused. "And she came forward herself. That matters." "Does it matter enough?" Clara looked at him. "That's not my call, Pete. It's his." She went back to her bread. "And he made it." Pete was quiet for a moment. In the considering way he'd developed over the months, he was less inclined to quick reaction than he'd been when she arrived, which she took as evidence that being around someone who thought carefully was contagious. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "Why do you always—" He stopped. Tried again. "Why do you always give people the most reasonable explanation for what they did, even when they hurt things? Even when they did wrong?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because I've needed the reasonable explanation myself," she said. "More than once. Someone looked at something I did that I shouldn't have done, and they found the best version of why I did it, and they told me that version." She set down the bread. "It's the most useful thing anyone ever did for me. I don't see a reason not to offer it when I can." Pete thought about that for a long time. Then February came in like it had a grudge. The second heavy snow of the season was worse than the first. Not in duration, but in intensity. The kind of concentrated bitter cold that tested every seam in every building and found all the places where the insulation wasn't adequate. The east kitchen stove ran 20 hours a day, and Clara let it because warmth was not a luxury right now, it was a survival condition, and she had enough wood stored to sustain it for weeks. The Harmon wagon came back in the first week of February, bringing an unexpected return: 2 sacks of dried corn that the Harmon estate had found in a secondary store after following Clara's instructions to conduct a thorough inventory. They hadn't needed it after all. They were sending it back. Dale Wicks wasn't driving this time. He'd sent his wife a compact woman named Frances, who had the look of someone who had been managing things quietly for years and was tired of being quiet about it. Frances Wickes handed the sacks to Samuel and then stood at the east kitchen door and looked at Clara with an expression that was part curiosity and part assessment. "You're smaller than I expected," Frances said. "Most people are smaller than expected," Clara said. "Come in." Frances came in. She looked at the shelves, at the notebook at the fire. She looked at the jar labels, the organized stacks, the way everything had a place. "My husband said you packed provisions and wrote instructions," Frances said. "He said the instructions were better than the provisions." "The provisions were necessary," Clara said. "The instructions were the point." Frances looked at her steadily. "He also said the owner of this place loaded a wagon in the cold at 4 in the morning." "He did," Clara said. "And you ran into a burning barn." "For the salt." Frances Wickes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The women at the Crossroads properties, the ones my husband told about you. They want to know if you'd be willing to come in spring, when the roads open. Come and show them what you showed this estate." Clara stopped what she was doing. "They can't pay much," Frances said quickly. "Any of them. But they have things to trade, labor, materials, knowledge about their own land. And every one of them is in the same position this estate was in last October. Plenty of resources and no system." Clara looked at her. "You're describing a significant amount of work." "Yes," Frances said. "I am." Clara thought about it. She thought about what she had built here, and how she had built it, and what it would mean to take that knowledge somewhere else. Not abandoning Blackwood Ridge, but extending outward from it, the way roots extended from an established tree. "I'd need to discuss it with Mr. Harrington," she said. "Obviously," Frances said. She wasn't being sarcastic. She was being practical. "But would you be willing in principle?" Clara looked at her shelves, at all those jars, at the notebook full of numbers and plans and everything she'd learned since November. "In principle," she said. "Yes." Frances nodded. She accepted a cup of tea, which she drank standing because she had a long drive back. She asked 2 sharp, specific questions about the preservation process that told Clara she was not a woman who collected information for social reasons. She stored the answers visibly, the way practical people stored things, not in writing, but in the back of her eyes, where it would be there when she needed it. She left. Clara watched the wagon go and felt something she was still getting used to, feeling the sense that what she was doing here was not contained to here, that it had edges that extended outward into the world, whether she intended them to or not. She was inside back at her work table when the east kitchen door opened without a knock. William Harrington. Which was unusual enough that she looked up immediately. He came in. He stood at the work table across from her. He had the look of a man who had been thinking hard about something for a long time and had arrived at whatever the thinking led to. "Frances Wicks," he said. "She told you about the Crossroads women. She came to the main house first," he said. "Before she came to the kitchen." He paused. "She told me that you were the reason the Harmon estate made it through. That word had spread to 3 other properties. That those women want to learn what you know." Clara waited. "I told her." "He said that you weren't mine to loan out." He said it carefully, watching her face. "And she looked at me like I'd said something stupid and said she isn't anyone's to loan. She's a person. You can tell her about the offer and she can decide." A silence. "And," Clara said, "and I realized she was right," he said. "And I came to tell you that if you want to go in spring and help those women, you should. And if you want to stay—" He stopped, started again. "If you want to stay, I want to make your position here what it actually is. Not cook, not kitchen manager. Something that reflects what you actually do and what this estate would look like without you." Clara held his gaze. "What does that look like?" "I don't know exactly," he said. "I've never had to name it before." A beat. "I've been thinking about it all week." "So have I," she said. He looked at her. "And I don't want a title," she said. "I want authority that matches responsibility. I want access to the main accounts directly, not through a manager." I want the ability to make decisions about supply and preservation and resource management without submitting requests and waiting for approvals that cost time we don't have. Done, he said without hesitation. She had not expected the speed of it. She showed that just slightly, and he noticed. I've been giving you less authority than the job required since you arrived, he said. That was wrong and it cost the estate. I'm not interested in making the same mistake twice. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had been absent from his own life and had slowly, painfully been returning to it. Who had sat in a cold room with a photograph and let her bring him tea. Who had loaded a wagon in the dark without being asked. Who had just said the thing she needed to hear in the plainest way it could be said. All right, she said. All right, he said. They stood on opposite sides of the work table, with the stove burning between them and the snow coming down outside, and the whole long winter still spread out ahead. And Clara thought about what she had walked into 3 months ago. A cold stone room with empty shelves and a dead stove, and everyone waiting for her to fail. She thought about what it was now. She thought about 41 jars becoming hundreds. About Ruth Garrison's face. About Samuel Carter saying, "I think it's going to be all right." About a burning barn and salt in her hands, and a man who had noticed. She was not a woman who needed to be saved. She never had been. But she was. It turned out a woman who could build something from nothing and keep it alive through winter and let the right people see her doing it and stand in the aftermath of all of it without asking for more than what she had earned. The bread's going to burn, she said, because it was true and because some moments needed a practical exit. William almost smiled. Actually, almost. I'll let you get back to it. He went to the door. Mr. Harrington, she said. He stopped. Thank you, she said, for letting me stay, when Eleanor told you not to. He was quiet for a moment. She wasn't wrong about most things, he said. She was wrong about that one. He paused. It might be the most important thing she was wrong about. He went out into the cold. Clara turned back to the stove. She pulled the bread before it burned barely with a second to spare the bottom crust darker than she liked, but the inside perfect, the smell of it filling the kitchen, the way it did every morning, the way it had since that first fire she'd lit in November when the whole estate thought she'd be gone in a week. She set it on the rack to cool. She picked up her pencil. She opened the notebook to a fresh page. She wrote the date. February 1879. Blackwood Ridge. And underneath it, she began without hesitation the next list. Because there was still winter left, and there was still work to do, and she was still the person doing it, and the list was how she kept the world in order, and the world right now was finally starting to feel like it was in order. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the bread cooled on the rack, and Clara Whitmore, who had arrived with nothing but a trunk and a recipe book, and $11 wrote the next page of the life she was building, not because anyone had given it to her, but because she had built every single brick of it herself, in the cold, in the dark, without anyone expecting her to succeed, and succeeded anyway. The snow stopped on a Thursday. Clara knew it before she looked outside, something in the quality of the silence, the way the wind had eased off in the night and left behind a stillness that felt different from the heavy pressing quiet of a storm. She lay still for a moment in the dark listening, and she thought, that's it. That's the back of it breaking. She was at the stove by 4, same as always, but something in her moved differently that morning. Lighter. Not because the work was done, the work was nowhere near done, but because the worst of it was behind them, and her body knew it even before her mind had fully caught up. March had come in quietly without the drama of February's final weeks, and the cold was still serious, but it was a different kind of serious. The kind that was retreating rather than advancing. The kind you could work against instead of just endure. She made her bread. She made her broth. She opened her notebook and ran the numbers she ran every third day, and this time, for the first time since November, the numbers had room in them. Not abundance. Not yet. But room. They had made it. She wrote that in the notebook. Just those 3 words with the date beneath them. We made it. She was not a woman who dramatized her own records, but she allowed herself that much. Pete came in at 6:30 for the morning bread and found her at the work table, with the notebook open and the pencil still in her hand, and he read her face the way he had learned to read it over 4 months of close proximity. "We're all right," he said, not a question. "We're all right," she confirmed. He sat down at the work table without being invited, which he had started doing sometime in January, and which she had never objected to, because his presence in the kitchen had become as natural as the stove, and the shelves, and the sound of the fire. He was 20 now. He had turned 20 in February, and Clara had made him a small cake from the last of the honey and the stored dried apple she'd been rationing since December, and he had eaten it in 3 bites, and then looked embarrassed about it, and she had pretended not to notice. "The South Road," he said. "Tom Briggs thinks it'll be passable by next week." "Tom Briggs is usually right about roads," she said. "What happens when it opens?" He asked it carefully, like the question had more weight than its surface. She looked at him. "What happens is that spring comes and there's work to do, and we do it." "And the Crossroads women Francis Wickies said." "I know what Francis Wickies said," Clara said. "I'm thinking about it." Pete was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the particular directness he'd developed since January, less hedging, more straight lines, "The estate would be different without you, if you went." "I'm not going anywhere permanently," she said. "I told Francis that. If I go to the Crossroads properties, it's to teach, not to leave." She paused. "There's a difference between leaving a place and extending from it." Pete thought about that. She could see him filing it away in the back of his eyes the way he'd started filing things, she said, which still surprised her, and which she took seriously as a responsibility. The morning went on. The workers came for their breakfast. The east kitchen filled with the particular noise of hungry people being fed. Not chaos, just the comfortable low-grade hum of a place that had become over winter a gathering point. The place people came not just for food, but for a few minutes of warmth and company before the day started. Clara had never planned for that. It had simply happened the way things happened when you consistently provided something real. She was filling bowls when she noticed that Samuel Carter wasn't among the morning group. She noticed it without alarm. At first he sometimes came later when the fence work was heavy, but by 8 o'clock, when he still hadn't appeared, she handed the bread distribution to Pete and went to find him. She found him at the south fence, not working, standing at it with his hands on the top rail and his face toward the mountains. And she knew by the stillness of him that something had shifted in the night, not something external, something internal. "Samuel," she said. He turned. His face was fine, no illness, no injury. But his eyes had the look of a man who had been somewhere else entirely for a while and had just come back. "I was thinking about my wife," he said. "This morning. First real spring morning, and I always think about her." Clara stood beside him at the fence. She didn't say anything. She had learned his silences. She would have liked this winter, he said, which was such an unexpected thing to say that Clara turned to look at him. He meant it, she could tell. Not the cold of it, but what happened. She always said this estate had more life in it than it was showing. She just couldn't. He stopped. She didn't live long enough to see it show. Clara was quiet for a moment. "She'd have liked you," Samuel said. "Straightforward, no nonsense, gets things done." He almost smiled. "She was the same way. Drove me absolutely crazy for 40 years. "That sounds like a very good 40 years, Clara said. "It was," he said simply. He straightened up from the fence, rolled his shoulders. The familiar returned to the practical, to the work that was how Samuel Carter processed everything, and she respected it completely. "Road's going to open next week. That's what Pete says. You'll have supply wagons coming in by the end of the month. What do you want to restock first?" She almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because this was what she loved about him, the way he moved from grief to grain supply in a single breath. Not because the grief wasn't real, but because the grain was also real, and both things deserved attention. "Walk with me," she said. "I'll tell you." They walked the estate together that morning, the way they had walked it back in November, when everything was new, and she was still learning the shape of things. But now she knew it the way she knew her mother's recipe book by feel, by the specific weight of each page, by what was on each shelf, and what was missing, and what she was planning to add. She told him what she wanted to restock. He remembered it all without writing it down, which was his way, and she had long since stopped being surprised by it. They ended up by chance, or by the subtle gravity of significant places at the east kitchen door. They stood outside it together for a moment. Clara looked at the door, the one she'd pushed open in October with the warped frame and the smell of rot and the cold coming up through the floor. The frame was repaired now. The window was clean. The chimney drew true. "You know what this building was before the main house was expanded," Samuel said. "The original kitchen," she said. "You told me when I arrived. It was the heart of the estate," he said. "Margaret Harrington used to say that. She said you could tell the health of a house by its kitchen." He looked at the building. She wasn't wrong. Clara looked at the door. She wasn't? She agreed. She went inside and got back to work. The South Road opened on a Tuesday, 8 days into March, and by Thursday, the first supply wagon had arrived from town, and Clara was at the main storage barn, directing its unloading with the master supply list she had been preparing for 3 weeks, the precise, complete, nothing-wasted list of what the estate needed to enter spring from a position of genuine strength rather than just survival. It was a different list than any supply order Blackwood Ridge had seen in years. She knew this because William had handed her the previous 2 years' orders to review, and she had read them with the close attention she gave everything and understood immediately that they had been ordered by someone guessing. She was not guessing. She had 4 months of consumption data, 4 months of documented waste and efficiency, 4 months of knowing exactly how much 40 people needed, over how many weeks, and what form they needed it in. The wagon driver, a different man from the one who'd brought Clara herself to the estate in October, looked at her list and then looked at her and said, "You want all this?" "All of it," she said. "I'll check it off as you unload." He shrugged and started unloading. She stood at the barn door with her notebook and her pencil, and she checked every item, every quantity, every condition. And when 3 of the flour sacks came off the wagon with visible moisture damage, she sent them back without hesitation. "I ordered intact sacks," she said. "Those aren't intact." The driver looked at the sacks. He looked at her. He looked at them again. "Ma'am, that's just a little... Moisture in flour causes spoilage in storage," she said. "I've spent the winter managing a shortage that was partly caused by stores that weren't properly protected. I'm not building next winter's shortage into this delivery. Send them back." He sent them back. William Harrington, who had been watching from the barn entrance, said nothing. He didn't need to. His expression said it clearly enough: "This is exactly right, and I am not going to interfere." Eleanor Graves was also present, standing slightly to the side, her role restructured now in the ways she and William had negotiated through February, more limited, more supervised, but present. She watched Clara send back the flour sacks, and something moved across her face that was not contempt and not admiration, but something more complicated than either. The expression of a woman recalibrating what she had underestimated. Clara didn't watch Eleanor's face. She was watching the inventory. But later that afternoon, when the wagon had gone, and the stores were checked and logged, and the barn was being locked up, Eleanor stopped beside her in the yard. "The flour sacks," Eleanor said. "Yes," Clara said. "I would have accepted them," Eleanor said. It was not a defense. It was a plain admission. "I wouldn't have thought to send them back." Clara looked at her. "Now you know to look for it." Eleanor nodded. A pause. "I owe you more than I can easily account for," she said. "I am aware of that." Clara considered how to respond. She settled on the truth as she usually did. "You owe the estate," she said. "That's where I'd put it." She paused. "Pay it there." Eleanor held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once and walked toward the main house. Clara watched her go. She thought about the woman Eleanor might have been without the fear that had made her small and protective and dishonest. The woman who had kept a difficult estate running for 4 years through a man's grief, who had known every supply line and every worker and every creak in the main house floors. That woman was still there underneath everything that had gone wrong. Clara had begun to see her more clearly lately. She went back to the east kitchen. The weeks that followed were a different kind of work. Spring work. The preparation work that people who had lived through Montana winters knew was as important as the surviving itself. clearing, replanting, assessing what the cold had taken and what it had left. Clara walked the gardens in the first week of March and found to her deep satisfaction that the beds she had mulched in November before the ground froze had come through better than the ones she hadn't reached. Evidence, data, things she would do differently next year and things she would do exactly the same. She was in the garden on a Saturday morning, her hands in the soil for the first time since the freeze, pulling up the winter mulch and checking what lay beneath when she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't turn around. She knew the sound of his walk by now. "The Crossroads women," William said. "Francis Wicks sent a letter." "I know," Clara said. "I got the same letter." He crouched down beside her, an informal gesture, the kind a man made when he wasn't thinking about position or propriety, just thinking about the conversation. She had noticed he did this more in spring, was less armored, less performed. "She's proposing a gathering," he said, "at the Crossroads, 6 properties. She wants you to come and spend 3 days showing them what you showed us." "I know what she's proposing," Clara said. "I read the letter." And she sat back on her heels and looked at him. He was watching her with the particular careful attention he'd been giving her since February. The attention of a man who had stopped looking past someone and started actually seeing them, which was a different thing entirely, and she felt the difference. "I want to go," she said. "I want to teach them. I believe in it." "But," he said, because he heard the shape of what she hadn't said, "but I want to be sure that what I'm taking out of here is something I'm also building here," she said. "I don't want to be a thing that passes through and teaches and moves on. I want this to be the center of it. This estate, this kitchen." She paused. "I want it to be the place I come back to." He was very quiet, the kind of quiet that had weight in it. "Then come back to it," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. The spring wind came across the garden between them, and it smelled like thawed earth and something green just starting underneath. "William," she said. His name, not Mr. Harrington, just his name, which she had never used before, and which he registered. She saw it register without flinching. "Yes," he said. "I need to say something that might make things uncomfortable." "Say it." "I'm not staying here because I have nowhere else to go," she said. "I'm staying because I choose to, because I've built something here that matters to me, and I'm not willing to walk away from it." She held his gaze. "That changes what it means. My being here. It's not shelter anymore. It's a choice." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was doing the slow work of a man who was taking something in rather than holding it at a distance. "I know," he said. "I've known it for a while." "And," she said, because it was his turn to have the question used on him. "And I'm glad of it," he said. "Every day. I'm glad of it every day." She looked at him. He looked back at her without looking away, and that was the whole of it. Not a declaration, not a grand romantic gesture. Just 2 people on their knees in a garden in early March, telling each other plainly what was true. Which was, she had always believed, the foundation of anything real. "The Wickies gathering," she said. "I'll go for 3 days. I want Pete to come with me." "Pete," he said with a slight shift in expression that wasn't quite amusement. "He's been learning everything I do for 4 months," she said. "He needs to teach, not just watch. That's how knowledge stays alive, not by living in one person." William nodded. "Take him." She went back to the mulch. He stayed in the garden for a moment longer, not saying anything, just present. Then he stood and went back to the main house, and Clara watched him go with the kind of uncomplicated clarity that came from knowing exactly who a person was and choosing them anyway. The gathering at the Crossroads happened in the last week of March, when the roads were solid enough to travel, but the air still had winter in it around the edges. Clara and Pete arrived on a Wednesday morning to find 6 women waiting, not the farmers' wives she had vaguely imagined, but women who ran things, who made decisions, who had a specific look about them, a combination of competence and exhaustion that Clara recognized because she had seen it in her mirror every morning of her life. She spent 3 days with them. She taught them everything. Not just the techniques, the preservation, the supply management, the tracking, the planning for seasons. She taught them the thinking underneath the techniques. The way of reading a resource against a need and finding the gap before it became a crisis. The way of making allies without making debts. The way of being the person who knew things in a place where the person who knew things was underestimated by default. She taught them the way her father had taught her, not by lecturing, but by doing alongside, by asking questions that led people to the answers, rather than handing the answers over. On the last morning, Frances Wickies found her in the Crossroads kitchen before dawn, already at work. "You could do this everywhere," Frances said. "Every spring, estate to estate. There must be 30 properties within a day's ride that need exactly what you know." Clara looked at her. "Maybe," she said. "But I'm not a traveling teacher. I'm the person who runs the kitchen at Blackwood Ridge." Frances looked at her with the sharp eyes that never really stopped assessing. "That's a choice." "The best kind," Clara said. "The kind you make on purpose." Frances studied her for a moment. Then she nodded the nod of a woman who understood choices made on purpose, who respected them for what they were. "Then we come to you," Frances said. "Next autumn, before the winter. Bring whoever needs to learn. You show us what the season needs, and we take it home." "That," Clara said, "I can do." She was back at Blackwood Ridge by Thursday afternoon. She came through the gate with Pete beside her on the wagon and the estate ahead of them in the early spring light, and she felt not for the first time, but more completely than before, the specific sensation of arriving somewhere that was genuinely hers. Not given, not granted, built, earned, chosen. Samuel Carter was at the south fence when they came through. He looked up. He raised one hand, his usual half-wave, the minimal gesture that was his version of a warm welcome. She raised hers back. Ruth Garrison's boy. James was in the yard running because he was 7 years old and fully recovered, and running was what 7-year-olds did in the first real week of spring. He saw Clara come through the gate, and he stopped running, and he waved at her with both arms, the total body wave of a child who meant it completely. She waved back. She went to the east kitchen. She built up the fire that had banked down in her absence. She unpacked her notebook, which had traveled with her to the crossroads, and come back with 12 new pages of notes and observations and questions the Crossroads women had asked that she hadn't had answers for yet, but intended to find. She put her mother's recipe book back on the shelf above the stove. She stood for a moment in the middle of the kitchen that had been given to her as a punishment, as a way of saying, "You don't matter, go here and disappear." And she looked at what it had become. Full shelves, a clean work table, a stove that drew perfectly, now that she had learned like a living thing, its moods and its needs and the particular sound it made when the fire was right. Jars of the last winter's preservation that she'd left on the shelves as a record not yet emptied and not yet replaced, just there as evidence. This happened. This was done. We survived. She heard boots on the step before the knock. "Come in," she said. William opened the door. He stood in the frame the way he had stood in it the very first time he came to this kitchen, looking at the shelves, reading the room. But differently now. The way you stood in a place you were comfortable in, rather than a place you were assessing. "How was it?" he asked. "Good," she said. 6 women who will come here in September to learn before the winter. I told Frances Wickies yes. He nodded. He came in fully. He stood at the work table, and she was aware of the particular geography of this room. Now how his presence in it felt familiar. How the space between them had changed over winter, from careful professional distance to something without a clean name, but with a great deal of content. "I want to show you something," he said. He put a paper on the work table. She looked at it. It was a deed. Not for the estate. The estate was his by inheritance, and she had no interest in that kind of claim. It was a deed for the east kitchen and its adjoining garden, drawn up cleanly with her name on it. She looked at it for a long time. "This building," he said, "was the original heart of this estate. It should belong to the person who brought it back to life." She looked up at him. "This is more than a title." "Yes," he said. "It is." She understood what he was doing. Not a romantic gesture, or not only that. A practical one. A legal one. A statement that what she had built here was hers in the most permanent way the law of Montana Territory could make a thing permanent. That no future version of Eleanor Graves, no shift in the estate's fortunes, no change in circumstances could simply send her back to nowhere again. She was not vulnerable here, not anymore. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I did it." She looked at the deed for another moment. Then she picked it up and held it with both hands, feeling the weight of the paper, the specific reality of her own name written on it in a clear legal hand. "William," she said. "Clara," he said. Just her name. Back to her. "I'm going to ask you to stay for supper," she said, "because I have the new turnips and the last of the smoked beef. And I've been thinking about this particular combination for 3 weeks, and I would like someone to eat it with." He almost smiled. All the way this time. Not quite, but nearly. And she had learned that for this man nearly was its own kind of language. "Yes," he said. "I'll stay." She went to the stove. Outside, the spring evening was coming in slow and blue over Blackwood Ridge Estate, and the garden that Clara had pulled back from abandonment was greening at the edges, where the first new growth was pushing through the thawed soil, and the smoke from the east kitchen chimney rose straight and clean into the cooling air. The kitchen that had been given to her as a place to disappear became the place that everything came back to. The woman they had underestimated became the reason the estate survived. And Clara Whitmore, who had arrived in October with a trunk and $11 and a recipe book, and the absolute conviction that she would not be made small by anyone's small expectation of her, stood at her stove in her kitchen on her land, and fed the people she had chosen and who had chosen her back. Not because she had been saved, because she had never needed saving. She had needed only what she had always given herself: a fire, a kitchen, and the unshakable understanding that the woman willing to do the work that others dismissed as beneath them was always in the end the woman holding everything together. That was who Clara Whitmore was. That was who she had always been. And Blackwood Ridge Estate